Good luck, everybody, and a good 2021 to everybody. Rabbi Kolobach is running a little bit late. He had prayers this evening. So while we're waiting for him, maybe I'll just tell you one or two stories that come to mind, but I'll keep looking to see when he comes in. He had to do prayers for someone. Okay, so what Rabbi Kolobach is doing is he's doing the life story of the Alter Rebbe, the 24th of Teves, who passed away the 24th of Teves, and he's doing the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was born in 1880 and passed away in 1950. So let me start with the story of the Alter Rebbe. I'll do one of the Alter Rebbe, one or two of the Alter Rebbe, and one of the previous Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe was in prison being interrogated, they immediately noticed that the Alter Rebbe was no ordinary person. And one of the interrogators, who was a very learned Christian, came to the Alter Rebbe one day. He said, while you're here on charges of treason, I can see that you're actually a very holy man. There's a biblical passage that bothers me. Won't you please explain it to me? And he said, when God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and Adam sinned, immediately God comes to Adam and he says, Adam, Ayeka, where are you? So he says, surely God knew where Adam was. So why does he ask God? Why does he ask Adam, where are you? So the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, asked the man, he said, are you aware of the classical commentaries on it, Rashi, etc.? He said, yes, I am, but none of those commentaries have satisfied my question. So the Alter Rebbe said, well, let me tell you. The Alter Rebbe looked at him and he said to him, you are exactly this and this age. And he mentioned his age to the day. And he said, God asks not only Adam every day of his life, where was he, but God asks each and every one of us, every day of our lives, Ayeka, where are you? Are you accomplishing what God wanted you to accomplish? And that's a story worth living with. There's another story with the Alter Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe was going to be interrogated, they took him from one place to another. They took him across a little boat on a ferry. And the Alter Rebbe looked up and he saw the new moon, and it was time to sanctify the new moon. So he wanted to do Kiddush HaChodesh. He wanted to do Kiddush Brichas. He wanted to do the blessing of the new moon. And he asked the guard who was taking him across, he said, won't you please stop the boat so I can stand up and say the blessing? He said, no, you're a prisoner. And immediately the boat just stopped. He then asked the man again. The man, realizing this was no normal situation, said, okay, as long as you give me a blessing for long life. The Alter Rebbe sat down, wrote him a blessing for long life, and apparently the family had it for many, many years, that non-Jewish guard's family, and they all lived to ripe old ages. The Alter Rebbe stood up, he made the blessing on the moon, and then the boat started again. He asked the interrogator who was taking him across, he said, now will you stop the boat? He said, yes. The previous Rebbe explains, why did the Alter Rebbe, if he could stop the boat the first time, why did he then ask him to stop it? He could have just stopped it himself. And the previous Rebbe explains, because you see, the Alter Rebbe wanted things done naturally. You don't rely on a miracle. You try to do things as naturally as possible. And those are two stories that come to mind with the Alter Rebbe. Now let me tell you a story with the previous Rebbe, which I think is absolutely worthwhile living with. But as I'm about to tell the story, I see Rabbi Kolobach come in. So firstly, I want to welcome Rabbi Kolobach back. A good vach to you. Rabbi Kolobach, today you and I both have Earth.Yohrzeit, so it's an auspicious day to hear stories of the Alter Rebbe. That's number one. Number two, I wish you a Arichas Yomim. Number two, just before you start, I was looking today, Chof Nisan, the 25th of Nisan, is the day that Alexander the Great met Shimon HaTzadik. And that, by the way, led to the story of all boys being named Alexander. But that's for another time. So lovely to have you back. People are waiting to hear you. Over to you. Good vach.
Good vach, Rav Mesinta. As you said, Arichas Yomim, to yourself and your family, for the Earth.Yohrzeit of your mother, and to myself and my family for Earth.Yohrzeit after my mother, Tzivya Liva Bas Moshe Chaim, and a close family of ours by the name of the Slutskins lost their mother. They're in the middle of Shiva for Ilana Bas Avraham, and they listen avidly to the shiurim, so I'd like to dedicate it in her memory as well. As Rabbi Misinta said, yesterday, Friday, was Chof Daled Teves, the 24th of Teves, and it's a very auspicious date, as it is the Earth.Yohrzeit of the Alter Rebbe. But the events leading up to this Earth.Yohrzeit I find very fascinating, and that will be mainly the focus of tonight. If possible, I'll be able to put in a couple of stories at the end. We'll see how we go. So tonight we're not doing our regular schedule, but it's about the 24th of Teves. In days that there wasn't COVID, even this year as well with the COVID, many Hasidim go to Hadich, the burial place of the Alter Rebbe, and daven there. Baruch Hashem, I was privileged with a group from South Africa to go to Ukraine and Russia and to visit all the Mekemis HaKadoshim, the holy burial places of all the Rebbes of Chabad and the Baal Shem Tov and the Mizritcha Magid. So Hadich is a place where many people go to, and there were many miracles that happened at that time. Now, the Alter Rebbe, maybe you could say similar to Yaakov, it says in Rashi, Vayeshev Yaakov Bikesh Yaakov Leishev B'Shalva, that Yaakov wanted to end up his life in peace as everybody else does, but the Alter Rebbe was not destined to have that. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia, and the route of his invasion led through White Russia. Now, the Alter Rebbe had been twice accused of high treason, and he turned out to be a most loyal patriot of the Tsar. When people hear about Napoleon Bonaparte, I wonder what their reaction is. To many people, he was possibly a positive figure. And in certain Jewish quarters, he was considered that as well, because he wanted to give political and economic freedom to all that would be under his rule. He was also against like a czar, a king, and he wanted to bring freedom. And the Alter Rebbe, however, to whom the main thing was spiritual rather than economic or political, he saw in Napoleon a threat to basic religious principles and spiritual values. In fact, the Alter Rebbe wrote a confidential letter to his chassid Rab Moshe Meisels of Vilna, who would play a very big role in this whole story. And he said that it was revealed to me during the Musaf prayer on the first day of this Rosh Hashanah that if Bonaparte would be victorious, the Jews would prosper economically and politically, but their hearts would be separated and alienated from their Father in heaven. If our sovereign Alexander will be victorious, though the Jews would suffer economically and politically, their hearts will become more intimately, securely attached to their Father in heaven. And he said, I'm giving you a sign, continuing this prediction. In your coming days, your beloved will be taken from you, and they will begin to conscript some of our Jewish brothers for military service. And Napoleon's star shot up. His army swept through the continent of Europe. But there were many different Hasidic leaders as to who should win. Most of the Hasidic leaders in Poland and Austria welcomed Napoleon's advance. One of them was the Koznitzer Maggid, who very much wanted it. And because they were very oppressed by the political leaders of the time, and they saw Napoleon being able to free them. However, the Alter Rebbe had nothing but contempt for the man whose arrogance knew no, and lust for power knew no bounds. The Alter Rebbe regarded him as the embodiment of Klippa itself, the antithesis of humility and holiness. And as discussed when we talked about the Alter Rebbe the first time, in his time, the Tsar was Paul, and he was assassinated while the Alter Rebbe was in jail in the second imprisonment. His son, Tsar Alexander, had taken over, and in fact, the first thing the Tsar Alexander did when he took over was free the Alter Rebbe, pardon him completely. And he wanted to gain favor by all his subjects, including all the Jews. So he did a special thing for the Hasidim by letting the Alter Rebbe go. He gave the Misnagdim and even the Haskalah movement, he gave them all. And so because he had freed the Alter Rebbe felt a sense of personal gratitude and loyalty. And those feelings were shared by many of the Jews in Russia. He, however, urged his numerous followers to help Russian war effort against the invaders. And in fact, with the aid of his followers who were behind the enemy lines, some of them were employed by the French military command. And the Alter Rebbe, believe it or not, was able to render valuable intelligence to the Russian generals at the front. And even as Napoleon's armies were preparing to invade Russia, the Alter Rebbe instructed this Reb Moshe Meisels to render intelligence service to Russia's military high command. The Reb Moshe Meisels was able to speak and write French, and as well as Russian and a few other languages. So he gained their confidence, and he passed on the information through confidential Hasidic channels to the Russian High Command. And as the Rebbe had foreseen, the French, after their occupation of Kovna and Vilna, looked for people with Russian and French for various duties, and he received, as Moshe Meisels, received a responsible position on the technical staff of the French High Command. Now, the French did trust the Jews because they knew how much the Jews had welcomed them in their other conquests. And so he couldn't suspect the Jews of Kovna Vilna of anything. And this Moshe Meisels was given a job in the strategic department where Russian maps were carefully studied and prepared for the commanders of the invading troops. And Moshe Meisels had access to highly classified information, which he passed on in peril to himself to the Russians through these channels prepared by the Alter Rebbe. In fact, these very valuable services earned him the grateful recognition of the Russian generals and reached the attention of the Tsar himself, Alexander. And Moshe Meisels became what was called a persona grata at the court of Alexander, and a position which he used to great advantage whenever personal intercession with the Tsar in Jewish interests was required. In fact, later when the Mittler Rebbe, as we discussed at that time, would gain a lot of property in which he would settle, or many Jews in Cherson and other, they came as a result of this Moshe Meisel's interceding with the Tsar. There is a very famous story told about this Reb Moshe Meisel's, that Napoleon realized there was a spy because somehow the Russians had too much information and were forewarned about where the attacks would took place. And he came into this tent at the front where Moshe Meisel's was there. And he looked around and he said, I know there's a spy amongst you. And without warning, he rushed to Moshe Meisel's. He put his hand on his heart and said, you're the spy. And he wanted to see how that body language would quicken the heart's tempo and he would be able to prove it. Reb Moshe Meisel's was so disciplined that his heart did not move any quicker, and that freed him. Napoleon took away his accusation of him, and Reb Moshe Meisel's later said that it was the Aleph base of Chassidus, that which the Alter Rebbe taught, that Moyach Shalit al Halev, that with proper discipline and proper working with yourself, your mind can rule over your heart to the degree that even that involuntary pulse of the heart can be controlled by the mind. That is what he utilized at that time, and that saved his life. The Alter Rebbe Rab Shneur Zalman was convinced that Napoleon would fall. And when the French armies approached Liadi, where the Alter Rebbe was living, the generals advised him to run away. So in August of 1812, Rab Shneur Zalman left Liadi, leaving everything behind. He had a lot of property and animals and things that the Mittler Rebbe writes how much he left, and he fled towards Smolensk. And when they reached Smolensk, they had to run further. For some 5 months, the Alter Rebbe and his family would suffer the hardships and perils of the road, and it was a terrible winter. And till they reached a village in the district of Kursk, and here he would have a severe illness, as we'll discuss at length shortly, and he would pass away at the age of 68 on the 24th of Teves. That year, Sunday was the 24th of Teves, Mitzvah Shabbos, like now, Parshas Shemois, at the age of 68, which is the same numerical value as Chaim, the Alter Rebbe would pass away. And the Mittler Rebbe describes the following details: that on Friday of the Parsha being Re'eh, the 29th of Menachem Av, a day before Rosh Chodesh Elul, the Alter Rebbe fled from Liadi. He was helped by the Russian armies in the area, and they gave him 60 wagons with escorts to take him. And that was not enough. Many of his family would have to walk on foot. And the generals suggested a route that should take him through, but the Alter Rebbe decided to go for another route, which was they wanted to go through Be'ev. He said they should go through Krasna, in order to cross the river Dnieper at the earliest possible time. And he covered a distance of 2 miles, and the Alter Rebbe requested the accompanying troops to give him a light carriage with 2 good horses. He got onto the carriage, accompanied by 2 armed guards. They hastened back to where he lived, and he wanted to make sure that nothing had been overlooked in the house. The only things they found were a pair of worn-out slippers, a rolling pin, and a sieve. They had been left in the attic. He ordered those to be taken along, and he said, "Please set my whole house on fire before the enemy arrived," first taking out the Teves scrolls, and he blessed them, and he left. No sooner had he left the town leading to Dnieper, the Napoleon's army reached the town from the opposite end. Napoleon himself, with his entourage, entered the town, and they inquired, "Where is the house of the Alter Rebbe?" When he reached it, he found it ablaze, the fire burning beyond control. As we know, the Alter Rebbe felt that if Napoleon would get any of his items, he would be able to do some type of harm. And Napoleon wanted to have something which belonged to the Alter Rebbe. He offered a rich reward to anyone who would bring him something that belonged to Rab Shneur Zalman, and no one gave it to him. The Alter Rebbe caught up with them, and they continued their journey until a half hour before sunset, where they got to a village, and they remained there the entire Shabbos. The following day, the 2nd of Elul, they reached Krasna and rested there. On the next Shabbos, 6th of Elul, they received news that the French were advancing. The flight was resumed. The wagon in which the Alter Rebbe traveled was the 3rd in the caravan. At the head of the caravan was his grandson, Reb Nochem, who was traveling with 2 armed soldiers. Whenever they would reach a crossout road, Reb Nochem would turn to his Zayda, to the Alter Rebbe, and ask for directions. In most cases, the Alter Rebbe would get out of his carriage, walk to the crossroads, lean on his stick, engrossed in contemplation, and would point to the way and give precise instructions as to the direction and road to follow. On one occasion, sadly, after receiving such instructions, Reb Nochem, leading the caravan, took a wrong turn. Some 10 miles later, the Alter Rebbe inquired, "Didn't you pass a certain village on that way?" And then they realized the mistake, and he told his grandfather. The Alter Rebbe sighed deeply, and he said, "Good is it when the grandson follows the road chosen by the Zayda. The reverse is the result when the Zayda is compelled to follow the road chosen by the grandson." And the Alter Rebbe had often said that may Hashem have mercy and enable us to reach Poltava before Rosh Hashanah. This mistake that Reb Nochem made resulted in many, many delays and troubles, and perhaps was the cause of the fatal illness which the Alter Rebbe contracted on the way. Reb Nochem never ever forgave himself for that mistake, and he suffered remorse for the rest of his life. If I'm not mistaken, he even stayed in Haditch by the grave of his Zayda. And when the Alter Rebbe left Liadi, according to one tradition, Napoleon was so upset that he burnt down the Alter Rebbe's shul. On the 8th of Teves, as they were traveling for 5 months running away, in the middle of a severe winter, they reached the village of Piena. Now, during this long journey, the Alter Rebbe had kept in touch with the situation of Russian Jewry, which was caught in basically the Holocaust of the French-Russian War, because Napoleon had a scorched earth policy. Wherever he went, he burnt everything down so that the Russian soldiers should not have anything. And he received detailed information on the terrible plight of all the Jews in White Russia, the invasion route of the enemy. And at that time, the invading armies plundered everything they could lie ahead of. And Alter Rebbe heard about the starvation that the Jews were suffering, and he was greatly distressed by these reports. And so there was one bright note during this painful journey told by the Tzemach Tzedek, the Alter Rebbe's grandson. On the termination of Shabbos Parshas Vayetze, the 10th of Kislev, they were in the village of Zemivka, and the Alter Rebbe said during the following week, Napoleon would suffer at the debacle at Moscow. His fate would be, which had been sealed on Rosh Hashanah, would actually come to pass soon. On the 11th of Kislev, they traveled and they came to Yevsekya on Wednesday. And then the next day, which was the 15th of Kislev, the Alter Rebbe was a lifelong member of the Cheved Kedisha. It was a custom then to fast, and he fasted that day. After the Maidav and breaking his fast, he told his followers to drink l'chaim in celebration of Napoleon's miserable retreat from Moscow that same day. And his joy, however, at the defeat of that so-called little corporal, whom he considered the arch enemy of the Jewish faith. We should realize how terrible it was marred by the thoughts of the terrible suffering that his Jewish people were going through. The Alter Rebbe knew that the retreating, starved, freezing, and bedraggled remnants of the French army would plunder all the Jewish settlements in the paths. Arriving in Piena on the 8th of Teves, Reb Shneur Zalman decided to stay there for a rest. The village of Piena was a large one. There were fairly large houses which were half empty because most of the male population had gone into the Russian army. The villagers were very friendly. They offered the distinguished refugees comfortable quarters and firewood without charging them anything. But now, the Alter Rebbe decided to embark on a relief campaign for the Jewish victims of the war. And he said that he would take up residence in Little Russia, and he planned to have the divided into 3 groups to help the Jews and for them to be settled in 3 places, namely the towns of Hadiach, Kremetchuk, and Romnia. And he appointed 3 delegations in order to implement the plans to help the Jews who were under such dire predicament because of Napoleon's army. One delegation, headed by his older son, Reb Dov Ber, who had become the Mittler Rebbe, was sent to those towns for the purpose of making necessary arrangements to prepare housing for the refugees. Some people were wondering, how come the Mittler Rebbe went to Kremetchuk? How far is that from Vienna, and what did that have to do with preparing places? It wasn't for the Alter Rebbe. It was for the refugees of the Russian, all the Jews who had suffered so much. And a second delegation headed by his son, Reb Chaim Avram, was dispatched to Poltava and Kherson to raise funds for the rehabilitation of the Jews of White Russia. And a third delegation, headed by the Pinchas Shik of Shklov, was sent to Vitebsk to supervise the distribution of the relief and to arrange practical ways of rehabilitating the war victims. For 10 days since his arrival in Vienna, Reb Shneur Zalman worked feverishly on his plans and projects to alleviate the plight of his brothers. That's what he was mostly interested in throughout his life. He always behaved in a way of gemilas chasodim, of doing kind deeds, as mentioned. And the first time he gave up all his dowry to save the plight of the Jewish people. On Monday, 18th of Teves, he fell ill and he became steadily worse from day to day. And Motzei Shabbos, Parsha Shemos, which now it's the 25th of Teves, but that year was the 24th. It's the 26th. That year is the 24th. Reb Shneur Zalman said, Maidav, Havdalah with complete lucidity of mind. And then he requested a pen and paper, and he wrote a letter. He wrote a note. The Haneshama Hashvela, the low soul. And it's a very deep letter in which he writes that in earlier generations, the essence of divine service was Torah, which was emes, but today we aren't on that level, and the most important thing that people can do is kindness, doing good deeds. And after he wrote that mystical message, he was given relief from his weary sojourn on earth, and he returned his soul to his maker. His body was taken to Hadich in the district of Poltava. There was no Jewish cemeteries in Vienna. One of the interesting stories that is told is that they accompanied the Alter Rebbe's Orein on a horse and buggy, and to take him to Hadich. And they saw suddenly the wagon lift up, and they looked and they saw there was a dovarach, a chazer, a pig lying underneath. And even in that state, the Alter Rebbe didn't want to have anything to do with tumah. And only after the chazer left did the oren come back to ground. And they wrote on the tombstone that here is the holy ark, the great and divine Rav, pious and humble, holy and pure, diadem of a real crown of the truth. He practiced the righteousness of Hashem and his judgments with Israel. Rabbeim Heishiv me Ovain, he many did he return back from sin. Our master and teacher, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the son of Reb Baruch, longing for holiness, his soul returned to Hashem on the first day of the week, 24th of Teves, in the year 5573 of creation. Now, the Mittler Rebbe writes the letter to Reb Moshe Meisels, and he gives him many, many more details about this whole event. And he says that the Alter Rebbe had predicted things in a manner of true prophecy. And he said that as soon as the enemy, the notorious oppressor and wholesale murderer, that's what they referred to Napoleon, entered Poland into Kovna and Vilna, the Rebbe, my father, began to talk about the interior of Russia. And he said that if Napoleon will not become too arrogant and act foolishly, it's possible that he will fortify himself and stay in Poland. And that then he wouldn't have lost the war. But Hashem frustrated his mind, and that was the root of his downfall, going into Russia. And he said, the Alter Rebbe said, that if Napoleon wins, it is a great distress for the Jews. Not one will remain steadfast in his Judaism. And then he said, I hate him with complete hatred. He is Satan, who oppresses the good with every manner of evil. He is the force of Klippa, the opposite of loving kindness and goodness. And I am assured that he will not last. As it says, evil kills the wicked, the kindness of Hashem persists, and chesed will prevail over din. And he said, this is a war between chesed and gevura, water and fire, and water will prevail. And the two essential aspects of the enemy were his petulance and callousness. He destroys countless of lives without any feeling whatsoever. He wants victory at all costs, even to self-destruction. And his arrogance and haughtiness is the second thing, to claim all credit for his might and power and his prowess to conduct warfare. In a way, these words sound similar to another anti-Semite or a bigger anti-Semite in our generations. And he said, the person who doesn't put his strength and trust in God Hashem will bring him down to degradation. The Alter Rebbe said, my father, the Alter Rebbe said, tell him every single day. And in fact, the Alter Rebbe sent messages to General Tolochin to advise him many things. And he writes that the Alter Rebbe didn't want to be one day under the reign or servitude of the enemy. So they fled in wagons and they left over, as I said, many, many other things. On Friday, before Rosh Chodesh Elul, an entire army of the enemy, together with the army of Vitebsk, some 40,000 men in all, approached Krasna. And the Russian forces were only 8,000. General Nabrovsky, writes the Mittler Rebbe, was under the command of Marshal Count Bertinka, who was at Smolensk with 70,000 men. But the enemy avoided the larger force and proceeded through Liadi and Krasma. And we didn't know what to do and how to escape. But the Alter Rebbe quieted us down. And When they came to Smolensk, there no one knew about the situation, and they conveyed it to the Count of the time. A large force was gathered by midday, about 30,000 people, and when they were on Rosh Hashanah, the Alter Rebbe called the Mittler Rebbe, and he said, I am much grieved about the Battle of Maresk, which is on these days. May it turn out well. And he said, today I saw in davening, he said, on the day of Rosh Hashanah, there's a change for the better. And we have won the war. Although the enemy will take Moscow, he will have no respite, and we will win. There's a famous Hasidic story about that Rosh Hashanah. As I said, the Alter Rebbe wanted Russia to win. The Koznitzer Maggid wanted Napoleon to win. And we know Tzaddik Geizer HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim, that generally they follow the tzaddikim, and there was a tumult in heaven as to whose side should win. And the psak in the heavenly court came out that whichever Hasidic Rebbe will blow the shofar first, that side that they choose will be the winner. So the Koznitzer Maggid and the Alter Rebbe knew about it. The Koznitzer Maggid, they say, stayed up the whole night, went to the mikveh early, and urged his Hasidim that the moment daybreak is, that you can already start davening, they should immediately rush through the davening so they could blow the shofar. When it came, they finished davening, they finished kriya, they came to Tkiyas HaShofar. The Koznitzer Maggid put the shofar to his lips, and he said, Oi, the Litvak won, and his side will be the winner. What did the Alter Rebbe do? He didn't change his order of divine service that Rosh Hashanah. Instead, he did everything as normal, but it doesn't say anywhere in halacha that you have to daven Shachris and Kiev before you blow shofar. So before Shachris, he blew the shofar, and as a result, he won the war. And he writes about how they were sure that the way the Alter Rebbe said, the way that they were going back, he said the Alter Rebbe cried, and he told the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek on Shabbos Shuvah, he said the whole of White Russia will be devastated by the retreating enemy, and this will be the balance of the Khmelnytsky calamity, because Khmelnytsky was not a little Russia and Lithuania, but there's going to be mortal terror and ravages. The Mittler Rebbe said to the Alter Rebbe, but Father, the enemy has not taken Moscow, and if he does, maybe he'll go in a different direction. And the Alter Rebbe, with Ruach HaKodesh Mamish, he said, the enemy will take Moscow, and soon, because even though he's exhausted and is like a corpse, his hard-won victory will lead him on to Moscow. But afterwards, he will suffer a fall of humiliation. He will not last there, and he will turn back precisely by way of White Russia and not by the way of Little Russia. And he said, mark my words. And the day before Yom Kippur, we arrived, says the Mittler Rebbe, in Vladimir, and we learned that the enemy had taken Moscow on the Monday before Yom Kippur, and the entire Senate, fleeing from Moscow, passed through. And when the Mittler Rebbe saw the carriages of the Senate of Russia rushing through, he said, look, you said that the enemy will suffer a debacle upon taking Moscow. And he said, the Alter Rebbe turned to him. He was wearing tefillin. He said, I will not deceive you. I assure you on my very life that the enemy will not go beyond Moscow, but will soon turn back. He won't go to Petersburg. He'll try to return home as soon as possible. It's quite amazing at the Ruach HaKodesh that the Alter Rebbe had in the seeing all these amazing details of how the Alter Rebbe predicted every single thing. And he says that the final retreat that Napoleon had from Kovna to the border of Prussia was his father's last day. On the 24th of Teves, Napoleon left the borders of Russia. And he said that is not by coincidence. It's Hashgacha Pratis, because to his last breath, he never ceased praying to Hashem for Napoleon's complete defeat and expulsion. And Napoleon's finally end will come when his own compatriots rebel against him, as the Alter Rebbe predicted. And that is, my friends, really the story of Chof Daled Teves. The Alter Rebbe has left us a great heritage, which we should undertake. Baruch Hashem, we are living in a time, especially with these Zooms, when more and more shiurim are taking place, including we should undertake to learn the Alter Rebbe's Tanya. Rabbi Mesinta printed those 12 chapters and others of Tanya in Chitas. We should undertake to learn Shulchan Aruch, but above all, we should undertake to do what the Alter Rebbe taught so often in so many Igros Kodesh, including those printed in the Tanya, which is the mitzvah of tzedakah. He told us over and over that the mitzvah of tzedakah is the mitzvah of the day. And now, speaking about Chof Daled Teves and the schusim of the day, I'd like to share with you a couple of stories of the Alter Rebbe. And the first story I'd like to share with you is that the Alter Rebbe once came to a small town, and for a short stay he was in the town. A fire broke out in one of the wooden houses. The local firemen had a very hard time keeping the fire under control, and the soldiers came from a certain garrison to help to extinguish it. But a strong wind fanned the flames, and in those days, as you know, the towns had wooden houses mainly. In fact, much of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch doesn't exist today because of fires that broke out and burnt all the manuscripts. And they were worried that the whole town, because of that wind, would go up in flames. So some worried townspeople came to the Alter Rebbe, told him of the danger. The Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman, asked, where is the fire? He was led to the house. He stood there for a few moments, leaning on his walking cane, and looked intently at the blaze. And as he was looking at it so strongly, the wind stopped and the fire began to subside. Within a few moments, it was brought under control and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. The town, Baruch Hashem, was saved. Everyone was talking about the wonderful miracle which the Alter Rebbe had done. When the soldiers came back to their barracks, they told the general about this miracle. The general sent his orderly to ask the Alter Rebbe to appear before him. When he came, the general treated the Alter Rebbe with great respect, and he said to him, "Are you perhaps a son or grandson of the saintly Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov?" And it should have been quite surprising to everyone that this general had heard about the Baal Shem Tov. And the Alter Rebbe said, "I am indeed the Baal Shem Tov's grandson, but in a spiritual sense, because I am a student of his student." So the general said, "Then I wasn't wrong in my conclusion, and I'm not at all surprised that you have supernatural powers." And he brings out a leather-bound volume. Pointing to it, he says, "Let me tell you a wonderful thing that happened to my father, which he recorded here in this diary." He said, "My father was stationed with his troops near the town of Mezhebush. He had received no word from his wife for a long time, was very worried. Seeing how troubled the general was, some of his friends said to him, 'Do you know, in this town in Mezhebush, there's a very holy rabbi. He's known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. People tell such wonderful things about him and say that there's nothing hidden from him. Why not go see the saintly man? Maybe he could tell you about your wife.' So the general, my father, decided he was nothing he could lose by seeing that man. He sent his orderly to the Baal Shem Tov to arrange a time to visit him. The orderly returned and said that the Baal Shem Tov said he was too busy. My father was infuriated. He sent back a message to the Baal Shem Tov to say if he refused to see him, then my father would put all the soldiers into Jewish homes, and all the Jewish homes would have to provide food and lodging for one or more soldiers. This was a very serious threat because the Jews of the town were poor, unable to afford it, and was also close to Pesach when the soldiers would bring chametz into their homes. But when the orderly returned, he brought the answer that although the Baal Shem Tov is too busy, nevertheless, a time had been fixed for the general to visit him. At the appointed time, this man says, my father and the orderly came to the house of the Baal Shem Tov. Through an open door leading from the living room, they could see the saintly Baal Shem Tov sitting in his study, his head bent over a book. By force of habit, my father, the general, went up to a small mirror hanging on the wall to smooth his hair. As he looked into the mirror, a strange sight unfolded before his eyes. Instead of seeing the reflection of his own face, he saw a familiar road, the road leading to his own hometown. Not believing his eyes and thinking maybe his imagination is playing tricks on him, he called his orderly to the mirror to witness it as well. They were both amazed. The road seemed to pass by them. They found themselves on the familiar street where the general lived. The door of the house opened, and my father saw his wife sitting at her desk writing a letter. As if looking over the shoulder, they saw she was writing a letter to him. In it, she begged him to excuse her for not writing for so long, because she was occupied with the pregnancy and the birth of a new child, a boy. And both she and the baby are fine. She longed for him to come home and to see his son. You can imagine, he says, how excited my father became. Forgetting where he was, he rushed back to his quarters, and there on his desk was a letter for him from his wife. He opened it and read it over again and again. It was exactly the letter that he had seen in the mirror in the Baal Shem Tov's house. And then this general says to the Alter Rebbe, I am that baby about whom my mother wrote to my father in that letter. You can see the whole story recorded by my father in his diary. Concluding his amazing story, the general asked the Alter Rebbe to bless him. And the Alter Rebbe said, be good to the Jewish people, and the Almighty will bless you, because it says in the Torah that those who bless Abraham and his children shall be blessed. And I'd like to conclude tonight with another story of the Alter Rebbe. And maybe this is also in honor of Doron's mother, Ilana Bas Avraham. The Alter Rebbe had thousands of Hasidim. And whenever any of them would have a serious problem, they would come to Lyozhna, where the Alter Rebbe lived, to ask for his advice and bracha. One of his followers, who lived in a nearby village, came to the Alter Rebbe one day with tears in his eyes. He poured out his troubled heart to him. He told the Rebbe he had a teenage boy whom he tried to bring up in the way of Torah and mitzvahs. He was a fine boy, devoted to his studies and observance of mitzvahs. Suddenly, something got into him, and he began to turn away from Torah and mitzvahs. The heartbroken father feared that his son might go completely astray, and he begged the Rebbe to tell him what to do to bring him back to the right path of Torah and mitzvahs. The Alter Rebbe said, do you think you could persuade your son to come and see me? The villager said, I'm afraid that in his present state of mind, he won't be willing to come to the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, try and find some excuse to get him to come here. Maybe you can send him into town on some errand. And once he's in the town, a way will be found to get him to see me. Somewhat encouraged by the Alter Rebbe's optimism, the Chassid returned home with a lighter heart. Thinking about a way of carrying out the Rebbe's suggestion, he suddenly had an idea. His son was very fond of horseback riding. Now, in those days, it wasn't considered nice for Frum Yidden to ride into town on horseback. They would generally go with a wagon. But his son didn't worry about what people would say. And whenever the opportunity presented himself, he would ride into town on a horseback like any country yokel. And so the Chassid thought up an errand and asked his son to go into town. And the son said, I am ready to do it, only if you let me ride by horseback rather than carriage. And his father nodded. The young man went galloping into town. Little did he know that this errand was really a pretext for his father's friends to get him to the Rebbe's house. And shortly, he found himself facing the Rebbe, who greeted him very warmly. The Rebbe said, why did you choose to go on horseback into town rather than coming in a buggy? And the boy said, I just love horseback riding. My horse is a very fine animal. Why not take advantage of such a fine horse? And the Alter Rebbe said, what are the advantages of such an animal? And he answered, reach your destination so much quicker. The Alter Rebbe said, that's very well if you're on the right road. But what happens if you're on the wrong road? You could only travel quickly in the wrong direction. Even so, said the young man, the horse can help you quickly get back to the right road if you catch yourself and see that you're on the wrong road. The Alter Rebbe repeated slowly and emphatically. He said, that is, if you catch yourself and see you are on the wrong road. Yes, my son, if you catch yourself before it is too late and realize that you have strayed from the right path, you can quickly return. The Alter Rebbe's words, said deliberately and pointedly, struck the young man like a bombshell, and the Alter Rebbe's penetrating eyes seemed to pierce right through him. He fell down in a faint. He was revived, and in a subdued voice, he asked the Alter Rebbe permission to remain in Lyozhna so he could renew his Torah studies and come back to his family as a good Torah-abiding Jew. And there's another similar story where a chassid got a son-in-law who was known to be a big Talmud Chacham, and he was on Kest, he was on Dari, learning, and suddenly he had what is called Sveikis in Emunah. He began having doubts in his whole faith, questioning everything. And he told his father-in-law. His father-in-law was very concerned, and being a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, he came to him for advice and asking what to do. And the Alter Rebbe asked his father-in-law about his diet. And he said, if in his diet he is eating cholov akum, that is even kosher milk, but not supervised by Jews milking, not cholov Yisrael, then that can add to his fakis in Emunah, that adds to his whole questions of faith. Check his diet, change it, make sure that he only has cholov Yisrael, and that should be the answer to all his problems of the questions of faith. A good vach to everyone, and I'd like to conclude by saying, may the schus of the Alter Rebbe and may us listening to his directives help to finally bring about the yearning and the request of the Rabbeim that Mashiach should finally redeem himself, and once more we will be with all our Rabbeim Tchias HaMesim. Thank you. A good vach.
Rabbi Kolobach, thank you once again. And also remember that the Alter Rebbe's neshama came down to pave the way for the coming of Mashiach. May he come
Amen.
immediately. We'll see you next week. Have a good vach.
A good vach.